Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It's good to be back with all of you. Darren, it's officially hoodie season. I see that you're wearing a hoodie, as am I, and I really do like this time of the year. We are just a few days away from Halloween to all those who observe. And it's cold, it's rainy, it's beautiful, it's everything in between. I'm certainly enjoying it, even though I'm spending a lot of time behind my desk lately. But it's been a really enjoyable season. But how are things going with you?
Things are good on my end, and I'm absolutely enjoying this weather as well. And I found that even though it's pretty gray today, it almost makes the colors of the tree leaves come out even more, just at the peak, basically, of the color at this point. But loving that, and I actually had a bit of a reprieve from the fall weather recently because I just got back from Houston, where it was 85 degrees and humid and very much shorts and t-shirt kind of weather. So that was a bit of a shift coming back. That was a great trip. As I said to you in our catch-up, going to Rice University in Houston feels like going to Narnia for me. I don't get there through a closet, but perhaps I should try that next time. Either way, love meeting up with people that I really appreciate and love there. And I have referenced to other people in the past that they say, supposedly, it's hard to make close friends after the age of 30 as an adult. I have found, yourself included, that some of the people I care most about, that I'm closest to, I've met all within the last 6 or 7 years. And a good number of people that I am feeling very, very connected to. And of course, it's related to all of these topics and our obsession with these particular topics, and maybe even a vocational calling around these topics. But yeah, so that was a beautiful trip and happy to be back, and looking forward to diving into tonight with a pretty meta perspective like topic, shall we say.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's I echo that. It's been really rewarding and exciting to meet lots of different people, and I love living vicariously through your journeys and encounters with folks in your travels. There's a lot of energy here, and I know that sometimes we can feel that energy wax and wane, right? I would say we might be in a little bit of a waning time to some degree in the topic overall. The sentiment, if you take a quick sort of litmus test, temperature test of the ufological social media spaces, it seems a little bit muted. It seems a little bit, down and out. There's just not a lot of incredible things that seemingly are happening. But maybe that's not as true as we might think. And I think it may be more of an example of our fatigue, really, just with the entire process. And here, I mean, if you've been following this for decades or even since the last few years, you may just be a little bit tired and want to see some really monumental progress. And we haven't seen that. We keep hearing that it might be around the corner. And I hate to be that guy that's like, it's always, going to be coming next year. I don't want that to be the common refrain. But, maybe we are just a little bit fatigued and are just not seeing things as they truly are. So, Darren, there are some things that are pretty exciting that are on the horizon, a couple of which we talked about before we got on the air here. One is that the Age of Disclosure film from Dan Farah finally has a release date on streaming, which will be really exciting. And it has, I think, a couple of live releases as well. And there's been some rumors that David Grush has recorded an interview. We don't know if we're going to get to see that, but I know Ross has alluded to that. That might be a possibility. Maybe in the op-ed, the long-rumored op-ed may be coming out. So it wouldn't surprise me too much if that gets timed pretty closely to the release of this film for the greatest dramatic effect. Because I think that is the point, right, is to really shock folks and get a lot of attention and get people talking about the kinds of individuals that are in this film and what they are saying. So, there's just a couple of things, but in addition to that, or maybe you want to reflect on that, what are some other things that you're hearing about?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely interested to see that film. I think many of us are. At the same time, I think, again, touching on something you and I both were reflecting on in our catch-up, this will probably increase the breadth of coverage of this topic, but it remains to be seen how much greater depth comes about in light of this, because this topic is so complex with the high strangeness and the nature of reality and how that plays in, which we'll discuss tonight. Because it's so complex and because people are so busy in the modern world, they may have their interest piqued when we talk about ETs, the notion of cool tech with UFOs and whatnot. But when they start understanding all of the rest and how Sasquatch is wrapped up in this, and dino beavers and portals opening in the sky and space-time being hacked and potentially beings from our future, eventually, in addition to disclosure fatigue, just in terms of the amount of time that's passed since 2017, there's also just fatigue around how many different notions do I have to entertain to make sense of this before I can begin to start hypothesizing how much breadth do I have to basically bring in here. And that's why I think it's complex, and we will see how many people actually come on board. I think the numbers of people gaining interest is increasing, but how much purchase we're actually gaining as a collective remains to be seen. Definitely looking forward to that film. I'm also looking forward to what David Grush might say. You and I both reflected on as well. There was a recent interview with Dan Sherman. I did a POC episode that you'll remember on his story. Wasn't really new information per se, but maybe just a new generation of people being familiarized with his story. He certainly wasn't backing down from his story. And if anything, as I said to you a few minutes ago, it's interesting that after decades of reflection, he came away seeing that he thinks these beings are not all bad, that while he was at first put off by the notion that this telepathic connection he had with these beings, and then passing on coordinates and other numbers that he took to be times and dates, might have been related to abductions that were about to happen, that they were basically letting the U.S. military know, specifically an elite group of the Air Force. So he backed out of his involvement because of that. But it's interesting to hear him say decades later, in reflecting on the nature of his interactions telepathically with these Greys, supposedly, and the entire nature of the enterprise, that he doesn't see it as a fully negative, malevolent thing, either on behalf of the military or the Greys themselves. So that's fascinating. I think something that I've been really entertaining is this notion that the term the Grey is actually a basic category of which there are many, many subcategories. And this has been talked about in some experiencer groups as well. You'll get somebody who's fairly new who will come in and say, the Greys are all bad. Why would we ever trust them? And I do know people who've had accounts that would say the same thing. But I know many others on the other side of the spectrum who've had really beatific, transcendent experiences by those same looking beings. Now, some people will say, so maybe that's just a guise. Maybe so, but nevertheless, this particular kind of form shows up over and over again, and there are many variations on that form, subtle differences in the morphology, and basically covers the gamut in terms of the nature of the experiences people have with them, as well as sometimes people realize it's their own initial fear and ontological shock that is making them react to those beings almost viscerally, but over time they develop more of a relational dynamic, and vice versa. The beings themselves seem to respond to people more positively when they realize they're not going to act like a cornered raccoon, basically. What catches my attention is that the more I'm in this, pretty privileged in that I get to dive into these topics from every possible angle with all of my time, basically. And I look at that and the conversations I'm having with people versus the nature of the conversation being had in Congress and whatnot. There's a big gap between those two. And even what we talk about in these podcasts to some degree is catching up on things I've been working on and delving into for months, basically. So that's a fascinating sociological equation where I see us slowly but surely having larger numbers of people being aware of this topic, but not a whole lot of depth in terms of understanding the nuances around it.
Yeah, I think that that's a good segue into diving into our topic, because there is a sense in which there's a lot of things that we wrestle with internally about all the mysteries that we hear about in the anecdotes and the whistleblowers and, you know, the sightings that seem to take place outside in reality and can happen to anyone. And when you hear those stories, if you haven't experienced them yourself, there's many things that go on inside where you're wrestling with, what does that all mean? And you know, could that happen to me? And a whole host of questions sort of flow out from that about the nature of reality, about the nature of the self. Who are we? Are we separate? Are we distinctly different from one another? Who are they? And what is our relationship with them? So there's a whole lot of questions that really spill out from that. But a lot of that thinking, that pursuit is happening internally. And so I know we want to spend a little time really kind of playing with this internal-external dichotomy and examining that and looking at whether there is truly a distinction there, or what is the interplay between one and the other. So I know you want to get started with this. So where would you like to go?
Well, I guess we should just set the table by saying that for those of you who've been around with us for a while now, you'll recognize that both Nathan and I tend towards an idealistic view of the world. It's basically this notion that consciousness is primary, consciousness is the bedrock of reality, and everything else is an epiphenomenon of that. And when that's the case, that opens up some very, very interesting possibilities in terms of what is the nature of what we're seeing and experiencing, even across different dimensions. How do these beings relate to us in terms of perhaps even a multidimensional psyche? Because, of course, from an idealistic point of view, in the biggest picture, there's one original mind from which all of the differentiation in terms of forms and personas and beings and all that is basically a fracturing or a outpouring of projection from that oneness. So I think we can all recognize that that's the big picture philosophical understanding of that. I think what I want to explore today is what are the implications of that? If that's true, how might that show up in how we experience ourselves and each other and these other beings and these other dimensions of reality, which you know that I've explored to some degree. And when you've done some of that exploring, as I have, it really does make you think about this particular dimension differently. We're often talking about interdimensionals and extra dimensionals and all that. But when you've been outside and you come back, you see this and you experience this as a dimension, one of many. And that's interesting. And even the notion of the self becomes much more complex, and I would say interesting as well. So as I was catching you up on some of the research I've been doing over the last few months, a lot of this has to do with how to make sense of all of these related topics and how you bring sociology, psychology, neuroscience, astronomy, physics, all of it to bear to make sense of what's going on here. And I think there is a coherent picture, but it is complex to unpack it. But I think once people unpack to a great enough degree, they will see it and recognize that pretty much all of the phenomena we have observed, both in our everyday waking experience and in these non-ordinary states and whatnot, as well as with these beings that seem at the same time hard to pin down, right? We're always getting blurry footage. At the same time, they seem to have had a vast and consequential impact on our civilization and have probably been around from the beginning. How can that even happen, right? I think all of that begins to make sense when you have this understanding that these are all refractions from the oneness. So that's what I wanted to explore. I want to get your takes along the way as we go through this really interesting journey. I think where we might want to begin here, beyond setting the table in terms of the nature of reality being consciousness-centric, is around the peculiar way that people sometimes experience these beings, whether it's UFOs, whether it's actual beings they're encountering or what have you. People very often, when you look at the literature, and I've seen much of this, for instance, in the archives of the Impossible literature with the Mac archives and the Whitley Strieber archives, that people very often describe these experiences as dreamlike in nature. They don't say they're dreams, nor do they say it's just like taking my dog for a walk. It's somehow some blend of the two. And that begs the question, what is that? And I had an interesting conversation with my colleagues when we were talking about how we're going to make sense of all this data from this literature. And one of our colleagues is a neuroscientist. And he said, well, based on my neuroscience background, we know there's certain states of consciousness. So perhaps the first thing we can do is map these different experiences into one of these states of consciousness that are well known and well established within neuroscience. The challenge is the way these people describe these encounters and these experiences, they don't seem to slot into any of those acknowledged states of consciousness. They seem to be a blend of two at least. So that already hints at the fact that what we perceive as reality and even our usual experience as a human being is not the full picture. So let me pass it back to you to get some reflections from you. When you hear people, and I know even on CAB, you've heard different experiencers talk about their experiences, and people wrestle with, on the one hand, they don't want to admit that it's a bit dreamlike because then people will think, well, you just hallucinated or you misunderstood what was a dream for reality. When you reflect on that aspect of the lore that you're familiar with as well, what do you come away with?
The struggle is real, and you can see that take place when they're recounting their story. Very few people who share these experiences have fully integrated what they mean, and often they don't have a final conclusion as to what their experience is, and you can tell it's an active process that they go through in their lived experience, just constantly revisiting that and reinterpreting that and trying to integrate that into their self. And so when you're talking about this, I think a lot about just the human condition generally, as it might map to the condition of source consciousness and the fractal nature of consciousness that we find in reality. There's a process of integration that has to occur. And that process is not a one and done, it's a continuum. And so you can think about this from your own lived experience. I mean, I certainly have experience with this. There are many different personalities within you and many different leanings and, sort of almost conflicting attributes sometimes. And you might find one of these personalities sort of bubble up to the surface in a situation that you aren't expecting. Usually that is when it happens, right? So it happens when we aren't in a state of complete control, where we are surprised, where we are frustrated, angry, energized. These different sort of expressions come to the surface, and sometimes I think you can find yourself even being surprised by that expression. You can say, wait a minute. Who is this? Like, I just acted in this way, and that's not the way I would act in the normal day to day. So where did this come from, and why? It obviously is a part of me. Why is that part of me more below the surface than on the surface? And it says a lot to our societal conditioning. It says a lot to our sort of executive functioning and how we are sort of slicing off certain things and keeping other aspects. But if you take that concept and explore that more broadly with source consciousness and all of the individuated consciousness that's an expression of source in a way is also doing the same kind of processing, having to integrate the entirety of disassociation and into a holistic picture. And so to some degree, I think perhaps our experience with this, and most of us aren't actually very good at the integration aspect, but our attempts to integrate is a kind of training for future integration as source. Like it's a building block toward being able to better integrate the disassociations at the source level. So that's how I think about this. It's a fascinating topic to explore. And when you bring in these kinds of encounters and experiences, it really does open up a whole lot of avenues as to what does it all mean, and what is the reality that I experience on the day to day? Is that quote unquote normal, or have I normalized it as opposed to the experiences that people share? Maybe that is more normal than we'd like to think.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about the implications with states of consciousness, as you pointed to there, not just in terms of the difference between a dream state and a waking state, for instance, or a non-ordinary state through deep meditation or through the use of a hallucinogenic or something like that, but even this notion that, yeah, we have different aspects of ourselves that come to the fore depending on certain circumstances, and that impacts our state and even the way that we actually manifest in that moment. It really is fascinating. And when you think about this notion that the most advanced of these beings will recognize not just external technologies, we understand it in the real world, quote unquote, but they will also understand from a consciousness perspective that you could even potentially break off or segment different states of being through which you could conduct affairs. And if it only happens in that state of being and a person doesn't usually have access to that state of being, they won't know how to make sense of it. They won't be able to integrate it. And say if you want to do things that are maybe a little bit nefarious, or you just don't want a society to know that you're doing it or a species to know, by doing it that way, you can basically keep it outside of the awareness of the larger culture, which speaks to what I said a few minutes ago when we have this paradox where on the one hand, there seems to be peripheral evidence pointing to these various intelligences basically subsuming this realm and having a massive impact on our entire history, but doing so almost always from the margins, so that you always have to read between the lines to understand that they are somehow influencing the picture. And when they can manipulate, again, for good or for ill, these different states of awareness, and when we are largely unaware of these states of being, then they can conduct in a way that's very stealthy. But coming back to this notion of the dreamlike experiences themselves, this truly is fascinating. And I think this is where, for instance, when we're trying to use artificial intelligence to parse out all of this information, you have to be careful, because the AI is partly drawing on what it's been modeled on from all of human civilization and what's been on the internet. And there, these basic states of consciousness exist. And here we're talking about a state of consciousness that is not well attested to. So the AI could easily miss the picture, and you almost have to make sure that it's nuanced enough not to just collapse dream-like into dream. Because that's the problem, as people go, I need to know, were you awake when this happened, or were you dreaming? We already know with the hypnagogic and the hypnopompic states that it's more complex than that. We have these kind of blended liminal states. That sounds like a good name for a show, by the way. So we know it's more complex, and these beings might be able to, even to a greater degree, fracture off different states of awareness. And if we're not able to access those, then this could largely happen without us being aware. And this often involves, for instance, only when someone goes to a regressive hypnotist are they able to uncover some of these memories. Prior to then, these little slivers, these little splinters of awareness that seems like their experience comes to the fore. But the challenge is the experiences are so strange. The nature of the reality scape that they seem to happen within is so unlike the waking state experience that people go, well, I've been raised to believe it's either a dream or it's real. It's really neither of those. So maybe I'm hallucinating, or maybe I don't know what to do with it, but they do nothing with it. So this is, I think, why we're at an interesting point. And I'll pause here and get you to reflect. When we talked a few minutes ago about how close are we to disclosure or confirmation, just like what happened with Whitley Strieber's front cover of Communion. And I'm still running into people who had bizarre experiences where they somehow had a feeling of familiarity when they saw that front cover. Now, take the fact that this notion of disclosure, in other words, that there's this interaction with non-human intelligences happening in our society and has been happening throughout our history. As we broaden the numbers of people, the swaths within our society that are aware of that, how many more people are going to have splinters of awareness begin to arise to the surface, that they begin to do further inquiry into what happened to me that one time? Because we're talking about potentially millions of people, right? Who knows? Maybe even billions. We don't know this number. This is part of the problem. But what I'm saying is that's interesting in itself, because as we get broader purchase, even if not greater depth in purchase, that means there's that many more people across the world that begin to maybe have just little hints of memories coming up, shards of memory coming up, that make them inquire further, and that might add to our understanding of what's actually been going on.
It's a little disturbing to think about in some ways, because you are acknowledging a potential state of reality that has been hidden, obscured from population at large, and the kind of shock that that might cause for it to suddenly bubble to the surface, if that kind of contact has been quite widespread, it could be quite jarring. And I'm reminded a little bit of the recent news that we heard from Dr. Beatrice Villarreal and the observation, the preliminary observation of potentially up to 100,000 transient objects in some sort of orbit, geosynchronous orbit with Earth before the launch of Sputnik. So you have a shockingly high number of objects there that were just always present around the Earth before we were launching satellites. And so it's a similar corollary. There could be this constant presence in the human experience, and really in reality itself. I don't want to be too anthropocentric. It could permeate all aspects of what we deem conventional reality, but it is below the surface, and we have not calibrated our attention to be able to acknowledge that. And so it might be an event, an accounting, a picture. And I think art is probably one of the greatest catalysts to this kind of expression and this kind of remembering. Is this awakening could very well happen through those avenues. I certainly have experienced something similar to that when at a concert or an art gallery, just observing something and going, wait, how do I know this? Why is this familiar to me? And then there's this grand evocation, this awakening inside of me that responds to that knowing, even if I don't explicitly understand what it is, but I have a visceral physical response to it. And so I think that is a very real possibility. And I think we need to be careful not to discount that could be a big factor in ultimately sort of that the full disclosure, that ultimate revelation that may occur.
Yeah, another interesting implication to think about is related to something that Whitley Strieber has said more recently. Now, first of all, Whitley has said many things over decades because he's had a long time to reflect on these things, and he's gone in many different meandering directions. But one thing he's talked about more recently is that he said this sort of as a cautionary tale, that we should be at least thoughtful about what we want here. Because from his perspective, when we acknowledge this as a collective, we actually create a grounding for it to more easily come into our reality and co-dwell with our reality, almost like a merging of dimensions. And from that consciousness-centric perspective, if it's all about what's arising from consciousness, then sometimes what can happen is based on what you can conceive can happen. So if consensus reality, as I've suggested a few times now, is actually arising as a byproduct of our shared collective consciousness, what happens when our shared collective consciousness acknowledges that these beings exist? Does that create a bridge for them to come in more fully? Do they only come in through liminal type states because of some limitation that they are trying to address? And this raises really interesting questions. And the notion of acknowledging something might not be as simple as it seems. It might not be just about, okay, finally we've acknowledged this is true. It might be that when a certain degree of the population accepts this as real, that actually changes the nature of our reality itself. This is something we at least have to consider when we think about a consciousness-centric kind of understanding of reality. Now, speaking of this notion of the way that these beings come in, the way that they interact with us, I think now would be a good point to bring into the picture something I've talked about before, which is why different people have different preferences for how they want to pitch how the phenomenon is manifesting. So there are people that are maybe in academic circles in the humanities, people I know, they're friends of mine, scholars who describe this as happening in a kind of liminal zone, in an imaginal realm. Meaning it's not dream, it's not the real physical world, it's some other third realm. Just like Starbucks was the third place you could go besides work and home, this is a additional realm that people can inhabit, they can go to. It's all virtual basically though, and that there isn't bleed through between our physical reality and these imaginal realms. And many of these writers will say this is exactly why we see both a really prevalent history of these beings interacting with people, but so little actual tangible evidence. They would say that points to the fact this is actually happening in an imaginal realm, and the people it's happening to just aren't able to really clarify that. And we have a lack of understanding in modern society that there are these other realms that coexist with ours, but they are seen as separate. Then there are friends of mine who are experiencers and even abductees from the 90s and whatnot, who really, really want somebody in a position of authority to say, you were right, we were wrong, this is real, this happened, and we need to apologize to you. Now, we can understand from a psychological point of view and be sympathetic to that desire for that to happen. And I've heard some of those people say, no, they know it's real. And what they mean by that is they know it's physical, they know it's here. In fact, I've even had some of those people say to me, I think it's all happening here. I don't disagree with that. The question is, what is here and what is real? This is the real question. And I think we have to be careful. And I addressed this in my talk at Archives of the Impossible earlier this year. We have to be careful not to sell the opportunity short here, because I think we're being invited to a much broader, deeper, vast understanding of what reality is and who we are as agents of its construction, ultimately, as fragments of source consciousness. And so when you look at all the challenges we're facing, some of which I'll get into because it's related here, this opening here, this opportunity might allow us to finally address that in a way that could really change things and could finally put our human civilization onto a better track. But let me just get you to reflect on that. When you've heard different people, again, even people you've interviewed on CAV and that you've talked to personally, who really want to be believed, they want to demonstrate that they're not psychologically hallucinating, that they are grounded people. But at the same time, the very nature of the experiences is such that you can't get away from the fact that it is weird. In fact, people like Jacques Vallée has said, if it sounds too conventional, he tends to doubt it. It's only if it's highly strange or has elements of that he takes it more seriously. So how do you reflect on that in your time in ufology?
Well, I've observed that it can be incredibly isolating, and that, we are a very social species. We want communion with one another. We want to be together. We feel generally safer together. And for individuals that have this experience, you hear a common refrain, I don't want to talk about it. I can't share this with many people. This really makes me uncomfortable, makes other people uncomfortable. And so what they do is they repress that. They don't share it. And then they kind of try to go about their day-to-day life, pretending as if nothing ever happens. Obviously, that's very difficult to do. You and I both know that repression isn't going to be very successful. It's going to bubble up in other ways. And so there's a deep need to have some validation of the experience and to be reintegrated with the human family and accepted in the human family, that experience was in fact real and genuine. And, there's a deep sadness to that. And I find those that have the perspective that this is all imaginal, I understand why they would hate that perspective. It's kind of maybe the prevailing way of thinking about these experiences in our modern world. But it also is very much an arm's length. Let's keep this away because I don't want it to penetrate the sort of space the carefully constructed space that I've made for myself and for the world that we find ourselves in. And so we keep that at our arm's length, trying to be a little bit more comfortable. And so that there's a visible discomfort that people from that perspective have when you put both of these individuals in the same space, right? So you have those that want to keep at arm's length, and they're literally physically confronted with a person who has had an experience, and you can see it. I know you've seen it many times. They just don't. It's like the brain starts breaking. They don't know how to process that, and then, but there is a certain point at which, through the dialogue, that the human capacity for compassion actually does break through. It breaks that impasse, and so that the two can connect in a way that transcends their prior predilections, right? So the person who's guarded and doesn't want to share their experience finds they can more openly share the experience, and the person who's guarded and doesn't want the experience to enter into their worldview finds that, well, actually it's starting to seep into my worldview. And so you see that interplay take place, and it's a really beautiful thing. And it's one expression, I think, of a dialogue which really takes place with anyone who's trying to wrestle with what all this means right now. The average person observing this and has been exposed to this content is going through that same inner dialogue between, I think this is real. I really trust what these people are saying, but I also want to keep it at arm's length. This is pretty strange to me. And so over time, those two things are kind of blending together, and it's giving birth to something new. And I think we just have to be able to give that some purchase, because like you said about sort of planning for that, I thought of this in a sort of scenario where, do you build the spaceports before you launch the spaceships, or do you build the spaceports once you know the spaceships are there so they have a place to land? It can be either one, but they're sort of both aspirational, and the aspiration is connection. You're either connecting with the beyond, or the beyond is coming to connect with you. And so it's, but you have to give it that anchor point. You have to give it that purchase. So I really love that. It's fascinating, and it does speak to the way in which this topic does begin to transform the way we understand the world and ourselves.
Absolutely. And speaking of how we understand the world and ourselves, when we think about this strange relationship that we have with the dream world, something I've been reflecting on is that this is well understood in our culture that major scientific breakthroughs or great works of art have been inspired, often people say, by some content that arose in a dream. We've had people like Gary Nolan say that when he's doing cancer research and he's stuck at a really difficult impasse, he will go to sleep, but first will hold in his mind's awareness the conundrum he's trying to resolve. And then often overnight, some sort of inspiration will arise that will help him practically do that. Now, that's going to very much tie into shamanic perspectives I'm going to discuss later. But first of all, we should recognize that because many people have been influenced or inspired by information coming through dreams, I want to point out here, again, that it's not just the beings that might be more towards the malevolent or selfish side that might want to fragment people's consciousness and do things with them and to them in kind of a liminal state that we don't well understand, and that keeps it out of society's awareness. But so too with the really benevolent ascendant beings. I think they are constantly trying to inspire us. They are trying to, if anything, augment the parts of us that are reaching for something greater and beyond ourselves, but without directly influencing or manipulating us. They're just working with our best intentions, basically. And they are the ones that speak to us through synchronicities and whatnot in our dreams. Now, there's additional questions around the multidimensional self and the fact that we all have a higher self that we are in contact with, I would say, and that a lot of that also happens through dreams, partly because we loosen the reins of reality when we're dreaming. We don't demand that it adhere to a certain kind of narrow parameter, and that allows things to come in that otherwise wouldn't come in, including trans-rational kind of logic as well, which I think relates to high strangeness in ways, that this is trying to break us out of the prison of physicalism in the way that we have been thinking. I think this is going on as well. So this raises questions around the nature of knowledge altogether. Perhaps it's always coming through some sort of interdimensional kind of interface, and that can happen both through non-ordinary states, through dream states, through meditation, or through these beings showing up and finding a way to show up in our waking state. This might even be a technological capacity they have. We are just at the very beginning of understanding this. Another case I can think of here to help people understand how this is really interesting and also very present in the literature, we think about the case of Yossi Ronan, a friend of mine from Israel. He had an experience in his apartment or his brother's apartment in Los Angeles decades ago, where he was having a dream where these very friendly, curious, and strange-looking, clearly alien beings were interacting with him. His guard was down. His fight-or-flight mechanism was down because he's in a dream state. You don't feel the same bodily fear. Then he woke up, was reflecting on that beautiful dream, suddenly heard sounds in the front room, thought the house was being invaded, that burglars were breaking into the apartment, goes into the front room and finds that those same beings from his dream state were now in his waking state. His reaction was completely different. Horror, terror, this can't be good. Is this even real? Am I going crazy? All these things that come up because of the different way that we show up in the waking state, which is already a hint, by the way, to what we've talked about earlier, where we have different aspects of us to step to the fore. We sometimes don't think about ourselves as a different kind of persona in dream, but it's worth thinking about here in terms of how differently we respond. But if nothing else, we don't have the evolutionarily derived bodily pressures to defend ourselves, this fight or flight mechanism. But that's an example of somebody who literally had both happen. And this, I think, speaks to the fact that clearly things are not as they seem, or not as we've understood them to be, because we have this clear delineation. Sure, you had a dream, that's great. Or sure, this happened in real life. We have very few times where this bleeds through like this so clearly. But what we're getting to here is trying to expand our understanding of what we are. And there are many experiencers who have pointed to this. And they'll say, one of the reasons why experiencers' voices need to be championed more in the disclosure conversation is not just because they are the ones who've had the contact with the beings, but it's also because they are further along in understanding we are much more than we've been sold, that we have immense capacity here, that we are reality wielders to some degree. They are more tapped into that. Now, because they are further along in that, often that has resulted in ridicule and scoff and all that comes with that. But this is part of the reason why we need to have these conversations, because it's not just about hearing firsthand from people who've encountered the beings. It's about understanding human potential at a more realized kind of level. Now, what this really comes down to as well is this iceberg metaphor, that when you picture that proverbial iceberg image, right, where there's a little bit above the water and there's a massive section of it below the water. It's much more below the water than there is above the water. This is partly why it's so dangerous to ships like the Titanic historically. But this very much speaks to the nature of the self. And this is something you and I have talked about when we've talked about idealism before. This notion that the conscious self is just the part, the ego, that's the part that's sticking above the water. Below that is a much broader segment, which is the unconscious self, or the part that we don't usually have access to, but that we get communication from through dreams and things like that. So things will populate in the form of dreams from the subconscious. That's one of the chief ways that it actually communicates, and that's why Carl Jung and people have said we should pay attention to our dreams, even while secular scientists are saying it's total hogwash, it's just a brain working out excess energy or something. There's no meaning behind it. Of course, in shamanic and indigenous cultures, they have what's called big dreams, a completely different understanding of dreaming. And then beyond that, right, beyond the larger part of the unconscious self, that I think, by the way, is the bridge to the higher self, you also have the sense that even below that, so you've gone from the island sticking above the water to the much larger segment below, but eventually that connecting with the bedrock of the earth, and that being like the collective unconscious, and that there's actually a stream of information and communication that can happen all the way up and down. And our task, I would suggest, and something I've been really working on, is how to increase the capacity of the flow through from those different aspects of the self. And I would say one of the reasons why people come away from these experiences changed and wanting to live differently, like having their worldview shift, is not just because they've seen beings who are benevolent and teach them that we should love the earth and all those things, but it's because they themselves have had something reconnected in themselves, right? In the literature, they often say, being with these beings was like going home. I was returning to source. People are tearful when they're recounting these experiences, very much like an NDE, which gets back to this notion that these beings are coming from subsuming realms, and that somehow they remind us of and reconnect us to something that's always been there, that we've just become forgetful of. So when you reflect on that and the way that these encounters, not suggesting they're all positive this way, but the ones that are, have such mirroring with near-death experiences and seem to point to some deep awareness in us, even if it's mostly unconscious, that we are from something much deeper, much older, and that we are much more central to the nature of reality than we've been sold so far.
Well, I think about the iceberg analogy that you have there, and what you observe above the surface of the water, and the mere act of continuous observation. You know, if you're thinking from the iceberg's perspective for a second here, you might think after a while that's all that you are. Whatever is above the surface is all that you are, because that is what is being acknowledged, right? So those that observe are saying that this is you. You're just this surface level thing, and after a while you forget that this deeper aspect, this deeper, broader aspect of you exists at all, and so the others observing you and intersecting with your life in a way that is non-ordinary, right? So they're observing you in ways that is not the normal way people observe you. That brings to the forefront this reality that there is this other aspect of you that you have been completely oblivious to, that has been there all along. And so that then begins to catalyze a kind of transformation within the self, where you're now looking to plumb the depths that you were not previously aware of, and to integrate those depths into the surface. So you're going to be bringing that depth up to the surface, and bringing the surface down to the depth and back, and so on and so forth. And so I think these encounters are ways in which they prompt that kind of deeper realization of who we are, ultimately down to that bedrock connection to everything, right? So it is this deep connection to all of reality, to all of experience. And so it takes that kind of non-ordinary type of intelligence, that type of non-ordinary intelligent interaction to prompt, to catalyze this kind of change. But the sad thing about it is, it's, as you've point out with the analogy, it's there all along, right? So I think all of us kind of just go about our day to day, and we don't realize this. It sort of struck me the other night. I was taking the dog out, and for the last trip outside before bedtime, and I stepped outside. There's acorns everywhere, leaves everywhere. The wind is blowing the trees. There are clouds in the sky. There's moisture in the air because it's been raining a lot. And I'm walking back to the house, and I'm like, I just observed, I can't even count the number of crazy things that are just happening in my experience. Like these are things that are just, I take for granted as being part of everyday life, normal, but each of them is its own miracle, like truly. And so I think that is an example of how, when you begin to play with these ideas, that they start permeating the way in which you experience the world. And so that then changes. It's like, we talk about liminal frames, that you're putting on a different set of frames to begin seeing the world as it is. And that then influences how you live and how you interact. So it's a lot to take in. Like we talked about many times, it's incredibly complex, because I don't want to say that these beings are, I think using the dichotomy of saying like the beings are good, the beings are bad, like as we talked about many times, it's just it's the wrong way to approach the entire subject, because it's the same thing as saying, taking a person and saying, is a person good, is a person bad? Well, a person contains multitudes. And we sell the person short if we say, well, they're all good, they're all bad. And so I think we have to be very careful with that black and white kind of thinking, because it doesn't map to reality as we even experience it ourselves.
Absolutely. And following that thread, even when we think about the history and legacy of abuse, and we see this clear pattern where those who have been abused often become abusers. And this is confounding to us on the one hand, because we say, surely if you've been through abuse, you'd be much less likely to ever abuse because you personally experienced it. You've been the victim. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. It's not that simple. And there's more of a bleed through between our experiences, and even in the infusing of our identities. That's partly what I'm getting at here. And furthermore, not only do people have these experiences with these beings and sometimes feel like it feels like a memory of a past life or another kind of identity, but I'm thinking here of Susie Hansen's book, and I did a POC episode on her experience as well. The book is titled The Dual Soul Connection, because she literally has this experience of, when she's on board the craft, a part of her that's a gray comes to the forefront. Now, what do we do there? So is that a good gray or a bad gray? Are they all good? Are they all bad? Well, this is in a persona of a human being that we wouldn't dare say is all good or all bad. Why would we say that about the gray that she identifies with as well? But the point is, we've already talked about states of consciousness, and that these experiences sometimes seem to be happening in a blended state that we don't even have a category for in the modern world. But furthermore, that the human psyche might be home to multiple selves even, right? This gets people nervous because they start thinking about multiple personality disorder, which is now known as dissociative identity disorder. But this actually is much more common than people realize. And even people we would say are quote unquote healthy, mentally healthy, probably have this going on. I would say we do for sure. And so I would say that Susie's not actually an outlier. She's actually someone who's had a certain kind of experience where she's able to recognize that she has more than one aspect of herself. Now, we're going to keep unpacking this, but I just want to remind everyone, if we're all refractions from the one original mind, then is it that much harder to imagine that there are even refractions within our localized version of what we think of as the self? And to what degree are we hallucinating the notion of a self? I think here about something I covered in the Techniques of Transcendence class in one of the early sessions. I talked about how science now can demonstrate that our body knows about a decision before we have even made the decision. So we have the experience of something being decided. Now, on a body scan, we can see 3 seconds beforehand that decision has already been made. So basically, we're hallucinating a sense of agency there. It's more like, and this is very much in tune with the non-dual thinking, a situation is just arising in our awareness. we hallucinate that I am doing it, I am deciding it. Now, some people might go, I don't like that because it takes agency out of my hands. And what I'm suggesting is maybe you need to expand what you are. Maybe the body mind that you usually inhabit is just one particular refraction of a much broader and deeper self, and that some of that agency is coming from a very different place that we usually don't have access to. That has been my experience. So in addition to this sense of the multidimensional self, the multi-aspected self, I also want to think about what this means for the collective self. Because you have to realize, when you take seriously this notion that all manifestations are basically projections or refractions of the original oneness, of the one mind, then you recognize that, just like Donald Hoffman has suggested, that you can have one notion of the self, and then you have two people, and that becomes its own kind of monad. And then it goes to a larger organism. This is understood, that this is basically the nature of reality. Everything is both a thing unto itself and part of something larger, all the way up and all the way down. So when we think about collective human consciousness, and especially Western civilization, you can see ways that we are demonstrating what looks like mental proclivities that are not well adjusted, let's say. So I've been really fascinated by Ian McGilchrist's work, and he's done this really deep dive into the left brain and the right brain, the differences, not just in the individual, but what happens as a society when we decide to preference one over the other. So I would highly recommend to people, and I recommended to my class that his book, The Master and His Emissary, it's a huge book, lots of nuance, very well worth getting into. And what I would suggest is that his central concern, which he's spoken pretty outwardly about, is that modern Western culture has become dominated by a left hemisphere mode of consciousness, while neglecting or marginalizing the right hemisphere's broader, integrative way of perceiving the world. So it's not just about two different vantage points, looking left and looking right, but with the same mode of understanding. It's a very different way of knowing altogether. So in his perspective, and again, this is based on empirical research over decades, the left hemisphere specializes in abstraction, categorization, analysis, and control. Now think about the disclosure conversation. How much is it framed in those kinds of notions? It prefers certainty. Is it real or is it imaginal? Utility and manipulation of parts. It focuses on what it can grasp, literally and conceptually. The right hemisphere, which should be the master, the left hemisphere should really be a subset, a tool to help the right hemisphere, because the right hemisphere apprehends the world as a living, interconnected whole. It's attuned to context, relationships, embedded experience, and meaning. And so McGilchrist argues that the West has over-identified as a collective with the left hemisphere's worldview, therefore seeing reality as mechanical, fragmented, and measurable rather than relational and living. This shift has led to an impoverished understanding of reality altogether, and this has produced reductionism in science, bureaucracy in government, and instrumental reasoning and education. And overall, what you and I have talked about several times in this podcast, basically the dehumanization of experience, the alienation present in human life. So I want to turn on to you for some reflections there, because in addition to what I'm suggesting here about seeing all of reality as refractions of the oneness, we have to be careful to understand that as you go from the one integrated whole into the illusion, purposeful illusion, but still illusion of the multitude of the plural beings and forms, that if you take too seriously that those things are actually separate and independent, you will actually kill the organism. The same way that a cancer cell mistakes its own well-being and thinks it can somehow kill the body without suffering the same result themselves. So I think this is really, really important. And I think that even the high strangeness that has confounded us partly confounds particularly us in the West, because it stands in opposition to this left brain way of understanding the world. Shamans and indigenous cultures have much less of a problem here. So let me turn it to you for some reflections there, not just on how the way we apprehend the world changes what we see and experience, but might even lead to a really negative versus a much more positive outcome.
I think a lot of people can relate to this. I think that the day we find ourselves in now is a day in which this can be felt more acutely than maybe perhaps ever before, because many of us spend so much of our adult lives toiling away behind a computer screen or repetitive task that society has said, do this and do it over and over again, sit in this chair, do it over and over again. This is the way that you become actualized. And this is the way that society itself becomes more actualized in the world. It allows us to achieve our greatest aims if all of us put our backs behind this keyboard and push, right? This is sort of the way that we've been told to approach the world. And I think we feel deep within ourselves. I certainly feel this every day, that while I'm doing this and while, yes, I'm earning a living and it's great and I'm able to, provide for my family and all these wonderful things that work affords us, it's severing this aspect of ourselves from the context, as you said, the context of the greater world in which we live. And we feel that viscerally, like that you cannot live a life doing that over and over again and not feel that in a very acute way, this divorce between the world as it is and the world that you've been taught how it should be. And so I think maybe we're at a time where we're able to see this in a way that we've not been able to before. Maybe this is becoming more present to us just because we've gone so far in one direction that it's so obviously grotesque now that we're asking ourselves, surely there's a better way. Surely there's a better way. There was a product that was released today, and I got a text from my brother about this. It was a humanoid robot, right? A humanoid robot. We're all talking about robots now, and the future is robotic and this kind of thing. Amazon just talked about how they're going to be replacing a lot of their workforce with robots. But this particular robot is marketed as something that would live in your house and help you to do, certain things. Well, come to find out, this robot isn't autonomous. It's not controlled by its own AI. It's literally piloted by a human being remotely. So there's a remote human pilot of this robot, and some of people might look at that and go, "Oh, this is fantastic!" Right? Here we have this. We don't have to have an actual human in the house with this person who needs care. We have a robot, and a human can pilot the robot from somewhere else, not ever considering how did we get ourselves in a situation to begin with where we have a human isolated from other human beings that would need this and have this proxy of human contact to replace it. Like it is so absurd. And so I think that kind of absurdity, right, is what really shakes us out of the place we find ourselves. So I very much resonate with this. I think we're in a day and an age where we might be able to make this shift. But it raises so many questions because, Darren, you and I both know the right side is completely atrophied in the world. We have not learned how to exercise that. And so I think we can all ask the question, is there a better way? But we really don't know how to do that. We've not been given the tools and the skills to express that side of ourselves and find that better way, chart that better path. So it's really challenging.
There's so much combat here. There's so much violence we do to each other, even just the way we talk to each other. There's so much miscommunication. There's so many ways that we look like a body suffering from a massive autoimmune disorder. That's what it looked like to me. And once you see it that way, you can't not see it that way. But I think too about how, in light of what we were talking about, I think often of the experience that John Mack had, not just because of the experience John Mack had, but also because of how John Mack represented all of us at a particular moment in time in the West. He was a well-regarded academic and clinician who had built up a strong reputation, had won a Pulitzer Prize for a book that he had written, and then suddenly got tossed into the ring with this notion of alien abductees. To his credit, he wrestled with it and said, these people seem to be reporting a quote-unquote real experience. It doesn't fit with my worldview, but rather than tossing it out because of that, he said, my worldview must expand to make sense of this, because this is clearly real. Let's be honest, many people would not do that. Many people today reject this phenomenon because it doesn't fit with their worldview. And then he thought, how can I possibly make sense of this? And eventually, after struggling, he was told by some people, you should go speak with some shamans. You should go speak with some indigenous people. He did, and as you and I have discussed before, he found that this very comfortably fit within their worldview. There was not ontological shock because it was never ontologically distinct to begin with from their point of view. Now, what this also points to, though, is not just an understanding of how these beings can be interdimensional and in relationship to us, but that we ourselves are interdimensional and that we can cross over these thresholds. This is a key invitation here, and this speaks to what I was saying a while ago about this is the invitation on the table. Let's not sell it short. This is not just about accepting that technologically advanced NHI are here. It's about recognizing we have always been much more than we recognize. And our culture, of all the cultures in history, is probably minimizing us and reducing us more than ever before in history. And that exactly explains why we have this paradox in modern life where we have more technological capacity and capacity to connect via the internet and whatnot, and social media and cell phones than we've ever had before, and yet feel more disconnected than ever. And to your point about robots being remotely guided, this speaks to the absurdity of the entire endeavor. When you start trying to frame the world through a left brain perspective where everything is a bunch of parts with no whole of which they are a part. Now, this said, I want to touch on something here as we get towards the back part of the episode here that speaks to what I hinted at earlier, and you also referenced it in the very beginning of the episode. This notion that we right now, in how we understand ourselves to be Darren and Nathan, are actually probably a multiplicity of beings. And I don't just mean the left brain and the right brain that basically experience the world very differently. And just like I mentioned that we kind of hallucinate a sense of agency, that really it's better to say something's arising in our awareness when we say, I did it. The question is, who's I and at what point is it done? There's also this question of, to what extent are we having basically a forum of voices present within us, and then the executive ego harmonizes those voices most of the time and gives us one overarching sense of harmonious self. But when we actually look at how to help people, even therapists have recognized this, and this has emerged in this movement called IFS, which stands for Internal Family Systems, where people might go, oh yeah, that sounds good. So they basically work on therapy and therapeutic approaches to families. And that's actually not what it is. This is a system founded by Richard Schwartz in the 1980s, and it's grounded in the idea that the human psyche is naturally multiple, not singular, and that this inner multiplicity is both normal and healthy when properly understood. So this raises all sorts of implications, because again, we want to remember, we're framing this within a consciousness-centric perspective. So what we basically see is refractions upon refractions upon refractions, not just of dimensions of reality like intersecting Chinese boxes like I described before, but even that we ourselves are a multiplicity. And this is fascinating when we think about something that you and I have covered a lot, which is religious history, religious tradition. You and I both know that notions like possession and oppression are part of Christian history. Now, modern secular people might say, let's get rid of all that silly possession, oppression stuff. This IFS system and the people on the cutting edge of it would say not so fast, because in addition to finding that there's a multiplicity of personas within the self, even people we would say are healthy, this is not an outlier. But furthermore, there are some people, for instance, in this book that I highly recommend called The Others Within Us, that speaks to the notion that sometimes different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of personas can attach to us, can attach to our energetic housing, if you will, and co-dwell with us. And that we too, in this therapeutic approach, want to help them move on. But rather than treating them like the enemy and evil incarnate, we instead invite them to a process of reintegration within the wholeness themselves, as we also seek to reintegrate and become more whole as a collection of personas within a self. I'd like to get you to reflect on that, because it has vast implications for the nature of the reality that we're in and also how we might understand the phenomenon.
I think the initial reaction is that it makes me a little bit squeamish, right? That there's all these different personalities residing within the self. That's I think a normal reaction to hearing that. But we know empirically that this is the case. We know this from studies where people have had damage to the brain, and different personalities, not only manifest themselves, but experience the world in different ways. So they literally some cases they can't see, even though they have perfectly healthy eyes, or they can't smell in the same way, even though a perfectly good sense of smell. So this is certainly a reality present within the self. But I want to take that concept a little bit further, even that in the sense that how many people on average would you say you have a mental model of in the world, right? You probably have, I think I looked this up. It's a few hundred people that you can have a mental model of the world, and certainly we can recognize thousands of faces. I think that's also been shown on average. What I'm getting at here is that we're we're adept at modeling entire personalities just based on a few interactions with individuals. We create a model of them inside of ourselves, and I think where we've steered wrong a little bit here is thinking that that they live out there and they don't live in here. But the truth of the matter is those models, those people, they only live in here, right? They only live inside of you, because your experience, your senses is all that we have. It's the only thing that we have connecting us to reality. And so in an abstract way, we can take this concept that we contain multiple personalities to literally mean all of the personalities that you happen to know. You contain them. They literally reside in you. And I've heard this put differently in that how many versions of you exist. And it's as many versions of you as people that you know, because every person that knows you has a different version of you. And then there's one more version, that's the version that you have of yourself, right? So this concept, I think, while at first glance feels a little bit off-putting and strange and scary, if we really start to explore it further and map it onto our lived experience, we can come to a place to realize that this isn't scary, this isn't abnormal, this is, in fact, how we interact with the world. We have these models of personalities all the time, and we have conversations with them, right? If you have friendships, if you have relationships, you have conversations with these individuals without them being in the room. You think, well, how would they react to this? Or how are they going to take this information? Or, what would they say in this situation? So this happens all the time. And I think that that's a good corollary to what we're getting at here. And then you can take this and you can go expansive with it. You can go up and you can go down. You can go outside of human to non-human and everything in between, because all of it takes place within the realm of experience. And I think that is where it gets truly exciting, because then you become kind of an explorer of conscious expression. And you can navigate just like you can put pins on a map. You can go and visit these different places through the aspect of transferring your mind to those experiences. And it sounds a little bit crazy, but we do it all the time. And I think it's a lot more normal than we might want to acknowledge.
That's it. I mean, that is what it comes down to, is that we're the fish swimming in the water that we no longer recognize as water, because it's our medium of experience. Points that people like Bernardo Castro will make is that even when you're doing scientific investigation, all of that is arising within your conscious awareness. So we cannot separate the environment from ourselves and our experience of the environment. That's all one blended whole, basically. And this also relates to what I was referencing earlier with abuse, where we say that it's really unfortunate and hard to understand how someone who is abused would become an abuser themselves, because they have had firsthand experience as a victim. Why would they choose to extend that? Now, this creates all sorts of strange conundrums around how we think about personal responsibility. What is personal, right? This is the question. And the reason why this is interesting and complex is that what they have found is that when people are abused, especially if it's really intense, for instance, sexual abuse, they will actually disassociate out of the experience. They might experience it the first time, then they learn as a skill that's very helpful in the moment. It's a survival skill to basically not be in their body when it's happening, even to the point where people are interviewed later on and they literally have no memory from one refraction of the self, right? Within this community of selves, basically. But furthermore, what happens is, I want to use an analogy here. When I lived in California, there was this deciduous tree in my backyard that was unique because what would happen is some of the leaves every year would turn yellow and brown and fall off, while the rest of the leaves stayed green. And so basically what happens is the toxins that the tree absorbs over time get sent to these specific leaves and they atrophy and fall off while the rest of the tree can stay alive and healthy. So it's an interesting tree to have. And I'm referencing this because what we have found happens is that because, again, there's a porous boundary between us and other people, which ultimately, of course, metaphysically are all aspects of the same one being. Because of that, what happens is when someone's abused, what sometimes happens is that energetic signature, and it's easier to think about it as a signature, get away from this concretized notion of selves. An energy comes in, and basically, just like what that tree did, the person, using that in air quotes, takes that energy and sends it into one persona, concretizes it into one persona that eats up, if you will, all of that toxic negativity. Now that part of that person now exists as an abuser because that energetic signature has now found a home in the new person. This is not to simply say, therefore, we shouldn't have any notion of personal responsibility. I'm not saying that, but I am saying it's much more complicated than we realize. And what will often happen when people are doing therapy with people who are trying to create harmony, and again, this is the point, it's not about getting rid of these other personas, because we all have it. It's actually a healthy part of being a functioning human being. And I would argue this goes all the way up and all the way down, just like turtles. This is the nature of reality, multiplicity of selves across dimensions and fractal layers. But for these people that are trying to resolve and integrate these aspects, what will happen is you'll have this demure middle-aged woman who's very soft-spoken and very kind, who's nervous about letting that persona come to the fore because it curses and it's cruel and it's mean-spirited, because it's the signature of that original abusing kind of situation. But a good therapist will say, please feel free, let that come forward. Let's just let them talk. And eventually you see him basically in this one situation, help encourage that persona to open up to the light, to literally do something like, can you visualize light above you? Can you feel warmth? Can you reach towards that? He's saying this to a disincarnate entity, right? The way we would frame it. But it still works. And eventually they are convinced that they were lied to themselves. They are not this dark individual that's forever on the evil side. They have been confused and abused. They are the result of abuse and fragmentation and separation. And by getting them to turn towards the light, they move back into a place where they can grow and expand and reintegrate, just as the person who's been plagued by this aspect, that sometimes is an aspect of themselves and sometimes is just this free-floating energy that comes in what we would call in Christian tradition, a possession or an oppression or a demon. It's some sort of disincarnate entity, but we have aspects of ourselves that also exist on that plane of reality too. So this really asks of us a much more pluralistic understanding of the self and of reality. And I think, again, we sell ourselves short if we don't, at the very least, consider this implication for understanding of the phenomenon as well.
Yeah, and I want to explore that a little bit with you, because we've talked, I think, broadly and kind of abstractly and about these concepts, and how could we bring this down to sort of what we're experiencing in the day-to-day conversation in ufology itself. We're really heavily focused on the next whistleblower, on the nuts and bolts craft, on the government secrets. We're not talking very much about the kinds of interactions that are taking place, the abstract interactions in particular, the conflicting messages that we hear. We're not integrating any of that information. So in your mind, how do we, and I feel like you can see some of this taking place on the very surface level of the people who are talking about this right now. Like you see it in some of the conversations with the Congress people, and they're doing these interviews. They sort of touch on this just a little bit, to where it sounds like they're really saying something profound, but it's also kind of playing with a lot of the tropes that they're really familiar with themselves. Often hear this. The best example I have here is mapping angels and demons onto this, right, which we talked about quite a bit. But how do we take this information, this conversation, and apply it to what we're seeing take place in the table conversation of ufology right now? And do you think that there is a path to where we can transmute that into something that is more healthy and that does make space and room for this understanding of the world?
I would say it's a good question, and I would say that what I think will happen for an extended period of time, sorry to disappoint the people that are hoping for disclosure by Christmas, I think what's going to happen is the data will come forward, outlier questions will be asked, like the questions I'm asking, the things I'm tabling here, and we will slowly shift our understanding both of ourselves, what we truly are, and of the nature of reality itself. And at some point, we will find this meeting point where there's enough common ground that we will have a map that can comfortably host the territory, which is the phenomenon. We often talk about this notion that the map is not the territory. And you made a great point that when we have this mental map of the people in our lives, they basically have become an aspect of ourselves, right? That we reference them based on, and we interact with them and relate to them based on how we understand them to be in our conscious awareness. And this can lead to lazy relating, where we no longer are updating the cache of how that person's showing up to today. And thus they show us something really strange. And we go, wait a second, this doesn't fit with my map. But I think this is interesting to think about the implications, because part of it comes down to this question of where is agency coming from? I kind of pointed to that earlier, that we already have empirical evidence that we hallucinate this sense of choice that is already showing up in our body. We, in harmonizing the left and right brain, we harmonize and hallucinate a sense of coherent self. We go beyond that and recognize all of us basically have these different personas, which we also harmonize with an executive ego function into usually one sense of self. But I just want to go a bit deeper here so we can really think about how much we are already doing this. And once we come to grips with that, we might turn and look at the phenomenon differently. Because right now we are othering these beings. We are saying, we're one thing, they are something very, very different. And that's partly what both tickles our interest and freaks us out a little bit, is that they're so other. But when we really look closely at how we make decisions, how we live, how we function, even the major decisions of our lives, we find it's more complex and arising more from a plurality than we might recognize. So for instance, when it comes to people we're attracted to that we might end up marrying and having children with, there's some suggestion there that there's this intelligence in the bacteria in our gut that is picking up on the bacteria in the gut of those people, and that is sending up a signal to our brain. And in this interesting interlocking neural network, we eventually think, I like that person. For some reason, I'm drawn to them. And it might be because when we go a little bit further into this sense of the collective self and nested layers of selves, that it turns out we didn't know this ahead of time, but that person was born within 200 miles of where my ancestors were born. So we once again are recognizing something that feels familiar, that we, in a larger sense, understand as an aspect of ourself. And this also helps us understand some of the racial relations we need to improve in our country and around the world, is that to some degree we are othering people. We are not expanding that notion of a self across enough layers to where we can find that they're part of us. Same thing with these beings, right? This tendency to turn the world into angels and demons, this black and white binary option, to turn the grays into all evil guys and the Nordics are all good, or vice versa, is that same tendency that once we get beyond the notion of the self, we tend to turn these things into these black and white options because it's less cognitive difficulty for us. But what we actually find is all the way up and all the way down, just different aspects of the self arising from this one projection from the original oneness. So in that sense, I would say that And this does get pretty complex, because when I've had these non-ordinary state experiences, I actually find that agency gets turned upside down, and I can experience basically Darren being the output valve for an agency that arises at some much higher level, even at a collective consciousness level, that still pours into this notion of what Darren does and what feels right to Darren, instincts that Darren has, intuitions Darren has. And fascinatingly, with physics, we find that if you reverse the flow of time, reality works just as well as a model. So even there, we recognize that we are basically projecting onto reality that it must flow in one direction, that there's cause and effect and those kinds of things. It's much more relational and dynamic is what I'm suggesting. So that means I would suggest that in addressing your question here, this is not just about aliens from elsewhere coming in and potentially invading us, as some people are concerned about, or coinciding with us as this new harmonized co-species kind of leading of the planet. It may be those things, but it probably is just as true to say, maybe even more true to say, that at some level it's an integration of a higher self. It's a merging of realities that are coming back together as they do away with the illusion of separation. There's something really profound here, because when you listen to Whitley Strieber speak about these experiences have been incredibly traumatic for him. And on the one hand, you wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy when it first happens, viscerally. And yet he recognizes that what it produces in the person presents the greatest opportunity for spiritual transformation in the history of our species. The question is, how are both of those things true? Can we open into that true unknown, the fear that inevitably arises from the bodily self when we think about that degree of the unknown? But what we're really doing, just like these therapists are working with people with different aspects of the persona, is reintegrating with some larger aspect of the collective. That may be the way out for our species. It's not about us just shifting our perspective on what we do to the planet, but it's understanding who we are in relationship to the planet. And that might come about in a roundabout way by understanding how we're related to these beings as well.
I really appreciate that response. It's a challenge. I mean, I think that we're faced with a lot of challenges in the world, and this just being one of them. Although we might categorize it as being the ultimate challenge, is that this true integration. It's a kind of metabolism in a way, right? We have these systems that are metabolizing reality as it arises, and it's sort of that conundrum in a way, like where's the line between your cells that constitute you and food that you ingest, right? When does that food transmute to becoming part of you, and it's no longer food, right? And so you kind of take that concept, and it's, we're doing the same thing with the experience. We're ingesting these experiences, and we're sort of metabolizing them, integrating them into ourselves. But really, there's no true separation. Ultimately, if you get down to the smallest bits, there's no true separation at all. It's just, it appears as if there is, and this is happening all the way up and all the way down, right? And that's what's so fascinating. When we discover these microorganisms, these incredible things taking place at the small level, and now we're discovering these macro objects that taking place at the largest levels. I mean, it's all the way up and it's all the way down, and it's where does you end and where does it begin? It's all integrated. It literally is all the same. It's all a part of one thing. And so I think that, as you say, finding a new map, acquiring a new map is going to help us navigate this territory. And, perhaps we will find that. Perhaps in the day that we find ourselves with the conflicts that we're experiencing, with the fatigue that we have in the left brain kind of thinking, that we will come to produce maps that have new value and integrate these kinds of things in ways that we have not ever conceived. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that will happen. It's incredibly challenging. This has been a really rewarding conversation for me because it is, it has been super complicated. But I want you to have one more thought on this before we close it out.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about what you were saying there about, the very micro level up to the very macro level. And what's fascinating is that when they map the cosmos at the most gigantic scale yet, they found an uncanny similarity to the appearance of a neural network, that all of these galactic clusters and these star systems and these planets within that looked a lot like different components of what we would consider a brain, a neural network. And that is a hint, perhaps, on a fractal kind of imaging kind of understanding again, that this is just the same oneness refracted on all these different levels. And I think, too, the encouragement here that I would want to end with arises out of spiral dynamics, because while I understand that right now people might be discouraged with the nature of the world and the way things are going, and it does look like we're going through a regressive stage, which, by the way, is always part of growth. It's never always going up, up, up. Sometimes you have to have those peaks and valleys as well. But within spiral dynamics, there's this understanding that you can empirically show, both in a human being and across cultures, that our understanding of what we should be concerned about does expand over time. That it begins with an individual fighting against another individual. Then we have family units, which of course is an extension of the self because of DNA. But then family groups come together and form tribes. And then we have villages. Then we have nation states. And on it goes. And what you find is that over time, we have come into existence notions like human rights across the board, animal rights. This didn't exist a few centuries ago. Even the notion now that plants have some modicum of consciousness, and we should recognize that and act accordingly too. Might this also lead to understanding the Gaia spirit, that the planet has a consciousness? And if we understand it differently, like I was saying a few minutes ago, that might lead to different policies ultimately. So the good news is that involution involves the oneness spilling out into the myriad forms. Evolution, seen from this more energetic perspective, is not just about organisms evolving. It's about beings remembering they're part of something larger than themselves. And so what we see is that over time, empirically proven time and time again across cultures, is that the sphere of care and concern gets larger and larger and larger. You go from tribal-centric to nation-centric to human-centric to planet-centric and eventually cosmocentric. So that's the good news. And I think somehow the UFO phenomenon, as we colloquially call it, is somehow wrapped up in that entire return to the ultimate oneness that we ultimately all are a part of.
Well said. Well said. Let's end on that. It's been great. Great conversation. Look forward to hearing what listeners have to say. Always appreciate your feedback. And we hope that you're having a wonderful time of year, whichever time of year you might be listening. Thank you for joining us. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.